the first speaker for the first track, which is Critical National Infrastructures and CERT. Presenting their work is Dr. Jaatun. So he'll be discussing on an empirical study of CERT capabilities in the North Sea. With that, I would like to hand over to Martin to start his presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Cyril. So this is joint work with my colleagues Lars Bodsberg to Olav Grøtan and my previous colleague Marie Mo. Right. And if I could just get the navigation to work, we can. Here we go. So the concept of a computer emergency response team emerged in the aftermath of the now quite famous Morris Worm, where Carnegie Mellon University got funding to start the so-called CERT Coordination Center. Now, as a fun fact, Norway actually steered clear of the worm due to one man, pictured on the right, managed to actually pull the plug on the Norwegian internet. There are now CERTs in many sectors and countries, and CERTs deal with incidents as they happen, with the sort of firefighting activities, but maybe even more with other things such as awareness building, training, and international cooperation. So the reality is that cyber incidents will happen. And we can all remember various incidents, not necessarily in the oil and gas industry, but certainly in the critical infrastructure and energy industry. So the first and most famous that is often referred to is the Stuxnet virus, which affected the Natanz fuel enrichment plant in Iran. Effectively ruining a number of centrifuges, putting the Iranian nuclear program back several years. More recently, we have the Dragonfly campaign, which used the HAVEX malware to collect information about many energy-related critical infrastructures in Europe. And then even more recently, we have the Indestroyer malware and the Triton-Trisis malware, which affected protection devices in Saudi Arabian oil production facilities. It's, for some reason, never been quite clear exactly which production facility this was, but there are some rumors. So, citing this report from Deloitte, cyber attackers have targeted crude oil and natural gas companies, and the effects and these attacks have been growing in frequency, sophistication, and impact. However, it's very difficult to find publicly published accounts that actually contain details about which facilities were affected by what kind of attack. So the study that we did was an interview study for the Norwegian Petroleum Safety Authority, and we had interviews with 12 experts in 2 separate oil and gas companies and 2 other drilling rig companies. And the interviewees were experts in operational technology rather than information technology, so that they're actually working on the sharp end in the process control networks of these companies. Additionally, we also interviewed 8 experts in national and international CERT actors, and these included CERT managers, CERT members who work with incident management, national cybersecurity coordination centers advisors, and management, a security advisor, security consultant, and what might be considered a bit pleonastic, an incident management manager, or rather a bit meta. So the high-level findings of our study, we knew on beforehand that there is currently no Norwegian oil CERT or similar. So there's no designated CERT that caters to the Norwegian oil and gas industry. And the people we spoke with did not really feel this as a lacking. They did not really miss the availability of an oil CERT. We do, however, have a CERT for the power industry, and we discussed with several of these interviewees that maybe this CERT, known as CERT, could be a viable alternative, sort of collecting more eggs in one basket, if you were. There was some potential interest in a potential future All-Internet Sharing and Analysis Center, or ISAC, but that's also yet to come. So the operational technology representatives that we spoke with were quite confident in their capacity in handling cyber incidents. But a question remains how much they really know about cybersecurity. And unfortunately, in this industry, there has been little focus on systematic sharing of incident information between the actors. So among the other sectors we spoke to in Norway, there was a question raised about how many CERTs will be too many CERTs. So the number of CERTs that eventually should be established need to be in proportion to the available expertise in the market. There's no point in establishing 200 CERTs if you only have, say, 50 experts that could man such CERTs. So you're also restricted by resources. There's only so much money that organizations are actually willing to spend on cybersecurity. This is a sad fact. Based on our interviewees' feedback, we thus conclude that it may be more sensible to focus less on increasing the number of CERTs and instead increasing the number of and participation in ISACs. So large organizations typically do and certainly should have their own response capacity. But in this respect, we did discover one particular challenge with multinationals that operate, in this case, in Norway. So the case that is illustrated here is that you can have an incident that happens on an installation in Norway. Now, the company in question, large multinational, will report this to their own CERT infrastructure in the company, which in turn will possibly report to their national CERT. In this case that we were told about, there was, however, no reporting to our national CERT in Norway. And also, after the fact, there was no feedback from the CERT in country X. So the national CERT is left in the dark in some of these incidents. So communication is key. We need to ensure that information from CERTs and other agencies, not only nationally but also internationally, they actually filter down to key personnel in the industry organizations. And in order to do that, you need to know who they are, and you need to know how you can reach them, and particularly about these small actors. How can you actually reach out to all the small actors? One other challenge that we were told about was that sometimes national security authorities, they're actually working at cross purposes with effective practical security. And the problem here is that just as nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, nobody ever got fired for overclassifying information. So organizations we spoke with had experienced that they had, from their internal CERT organizations, they had communicated attack information, alerts to the national CERT, and then at some point later, they got this same information returned back to them, but this time suddenly it's classified. And this is a major problem in many of these organizations because traditional military classifications, or the NATO restricted or EU restricted or whatever, they don't have any organization to handle that in these companies. They, of course, will know about company confidential and similar and treat sensitive information sensibly. But as soon as something is classified according to national security regulations, the most probable outcome is that this information will never actually reach its intended recipient. So in the international CERT community, there's an alternative form of classifying information, which is referred to as the traffic light protocol. And just like the traffic lights that you encounter every day, it goes from TLP red via TLP amber to TLP green, and there's also a fourth category called TLP white. The latter one is quite simply that there is no restrictions on information sharing, and there is no risk in sharing this information. So TLP green is information that can be shared with other players within the sector. So it's useful for awareness, but should not be shared outside the sector. TLP amber may be shared internally by the recipient's organization or partners. So partners that you are working with directly. So for instance, a supplier, or otherwise, if you are a drilling rig company, for instance, you would be able to share this information with your oil services company that you are using. And then finally, the TLP red is only for the intended recipient, not to be shared beyond that. So this approach is much more pragmatic in this industry than using the classification schemes from the national security agencies. So based on our study, we can make some recommendations. And of course, we are a research institute, so we, of course, always encourage to do more research. This is more than just tongue-in-cheek, because there is a problem in terms of studying security, active security incident response, in that many respondents are quite reluctant to share information. And in this case, I think we can only thank our close relation with the Norwegian Petroleum Safety Authority that opened many doors for us to talk to these industry representatives. Another recommendation or conclusion is that we believe that there may already be enough CERT cooks to spoil the broth. So establishing yet another CERT for the oil industry may not be the way to go. We have carefully suggested that maybe looking at CERT and maybe evolving that into some sort of cross-national energy CERT may be a better approach. In general, of course, there's a need in the industry to coordinate the approach to ICT security in IT and OT systems, because there are significant differences in technical solutions, terminology, and culture. And there is this issue about safety regulations that currently are the remit of the Petroleum Safety Authority. This is where they do their assessments, and they rate companies according to these regulations. But the problem with these regulations in terms of ICT security is that they are not that clear on that specific point. So this is an area for improvement in terms of the regulations. And of course, there should be strengthened cybersecurity knowledge in the industry, because this problem is only going to increase in the future. And that concludes my presentation. I will be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Martin. That was really good. Thanks for sharing CERT in the North Sea, which is quite a novel research. So we're looking at the Q&A window to see if there are questions from the audience. So we've got one question for you, Martin. So what is different between a normal CERT or industry CERT to CERT in the North Sea?
Strictly speaking, there's no difference per se, but it's the domain that will be different. So it's about domain knowledge. And of course, the traditional way that operations in the North Sea and other oil exploration and production facilities is they have been more isolated. So in the past, they've had less experience with dealing with these kinds of attacks. But like I indicated earlier, these kinds of attacks are likely to only increase in the future due to things like increased interconnection, etc.
Okay, we've got time for one more, two at least, questions. So with the work you've done, research-based, what would be regarded as the next thing in terms of future work in this area?
So we are currently doing another fairly large effort for the Norwegian Petroleum Safety Authority, where we are studying several aspects, not specifically on the CERT capacity, but rather on the knowledge on and guidance on cybersecurity in this domain. And so that's our, it's going to be a major focus for us in the coming months, and we will be publishing a guide for the Norwegian oil industry on how to handle cybersecurity, particularly with a sort of a gap analysis with the traditional recommendations that are made for office systems and any specific modifications that will need to be done when you move into this area of operational technology.
Okay, looking at the Q&A, we've got time for one more. In terms of the recommendations, you, hang on. So is there any incentive from the power grid sector to join forces with the OU1 and coordinating force to have information sharing to mitigate risk?
That's a very good question. And now the interesting thing is that CERT is actually not a public authority. It's a private company that is working subscription based. So as far as they are concerned, there are probably only advantages, because that will allow them to increase their reach and have more of this sense of critical mass. So they could concentrate more expertise within their operations, and be able to also share more, because there are, of course, even though clearly there are differences between the power industry and the power generation that is typically hydro in Norway. There are also similarities in terms of the kind of process control systems that are used, etc. So there's a lot of should be a lot of synergy that could be used here and achieved.
Okay, let's just look at it. If we can squeeze one more. Okay. No, we haven't got another question for you, but if I may, can I ask one myself?
Absolutely.
So in terms of one of the things you mentioned, how much of CERT, how much of the work they do, is there any measures in terms of barometer? Is there a guide you could say, okay, if you had 1,000 CERTs for a national, say I'm emphasizing on national CERT, that's enough, or that's so little? What would be your advice in that respect?
So, so we do have a national CERT known as CERT, but of course they are very focused on national security. So they restrict themselves typically to critical infrastructure. And another fun fact is that the oil industry is actually not considered part of Norwegian critical infrastructure, because, and this is by definition, how long could we survive in Norway without our oil production facilities? And that's actually fairly long, because Norway relies much more on electric heating, for instance, than any fossil fuel heating. So, but incidentally, Norwegian gas production in the North Sea is actually considered part of the German critical infrastructure, which is sort of interesting. So in terms of how much is enough, like I said in my presentation, it's closely tied to what amount of expertise is available in the market. So currently we've heard, and this is also before the Corona crisis, that the job market for security specialists is very tight. It's very difficult to hire security specialists. And of course, this would not help if you suddenly started creating even more positions in this space. So that, in my mind, is also an argument to try to avoid fragmentation.